This is the IDP After Show.
Welcome to the IDP After Show. I am your host, Jeff Pomazal. I am pleased and privileged to be sharing the space tonight with the writer and ranker over at footballguys.com, Mr. Dynasty Tripp. Tripp, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jeff. I appreciate you having me on. It's always great to be on a pod with the gentleman from the IDP show, and I'm excited to talk some football with you and get into the AFC and NFC South divisions. Where I hail from the South, and I'm happy to talk about the Southern teams.
When we were looking at kind of laying out the mapping of the episodes and things like that, your name came up right away to do the South, and it was like that was an easy layup for us. So I appreciate you being on.
Happy to do it.
Good. All right. So in this episode of the IDP After Show, Tripp and I are going to be bringing you the third installment of the IDP Battle Royale series. And for those of you that are new to the IDP Battle Royale concept, it's where we're going to be pitting an AFC division against their NFC counterpart by setting an all-star lineup and seeing which team comes out on top from an IDP fantasy perspective. The starting lineup will consist of 2 defensive tackles, 2 defensive ends, 3 linebackers, 2 cornerbacks, 2 safeties, and 1 flex for each division. We'll be awarding points for each positional group and crowning an overall divisional winner at the end of the show. In the previous episodes, Aaron Evers and I crowned the AFC North the champions over the NFC North, and Johnny the Greek and I had crowned the AFC East over the NFC East. So the AFC has really been running away with this, and we'll see tonight if the AFC continues to dominate or if the NFC decides to show up and turn the tide. So that's what we'll be doing here. We'll be pitting the Texans, Colts, Jaguars, and Titans facing off against the Falcons, Panthers, Saints, and Bucks. Tripp, you ready to do this thing?
Yes, sir. Let's do it.
All right. So who do we have representing the AFC South at the defensive tackle position?
Well, first we got the overall number 1 scorer at the position in some formats, which is DeForest Buckner from the Indianapolis Colts at the first defensive tackle spot. And running alongside him, I put in Jeffrey Simmons, who's probably top 6 or 7 pick, I would reckon, at the position too. So this is a really strong unit we have here. I think that Buckner is not showing any signs of slowing down, and Simmons we might not have seen his ceiling. I think that he's an exciting player, and I like what the new defensive coordinator is doing there, Denard Wilson for Tennessee. I think he may have an opportunity to make even more of an impact this year. So this is a great duo to represent just one of the 8 divisions in the NFL.
Yeah, when you mentioned Buckner, he led the way with 214 points last year in Big 3 scoring. You know, having 8 sacks and 81 tackles is pretty impressive from the interior defensive line. So the Colts definitely added some more firepower in the draft with Latu, so maybe we'll kind of continue to see that ascension for Buckner this season. So kind of shifting to the outside of the defensive line, who do you have as the defensive ends that represent the AFC South?
Well, this is another tough one in the sense that you have some really good players to choose from at this position in the AFC South. And so my first one is a guy that's new to the AFC South in the person of Danielle Hunter, who was, of course, with the Minnesota Vikings for several years. And he shows up now in Houston, replacing Jonathan Grenard at one edge position right there. And it's interesting they make that transition from the younger player to the older player, but those two obviously switch cities and teams there. But Hunter had like 18 sacks last year, and it's still only like 29 years old. So not even that old. It feels like he's been in the league for 10 years. But every year that he's been healthy, he's been productive and putting up huge sack numbers, and has had healthy tackle numbers too for quite a few of those years. So that's my top pick at the edge position, and running right there neck and neck with him, I would say would be the newly renamed Joshua Hines Allen from the Jacksonville Jaguars, which I'm glad that he's changed his name in the sense we don't have to confuse him with the quarterback in Buffalo. So I'm good with that. So Josh Hines Allen is the next edge, and he really broke out and showed that he was an elite edge player last year. And I like him too. He's prime of his career. I like him to continue his production. And so once again, a position where we just have 2 top tier guys. I mean, you could put up the AFC South and these 2 positions up against the entire NFC at the rate we're going.
Do And it's funny that you mentioned how loaded this position is, especially in the AFC South. Do you feel that, like, now obviously with Danielle Hunter being in Houston, and somebody will probably mention a little bit later, Will Anderson, do you think that helps each of those players from a fantasy perspective, or does that maybe kind of like put a cap or a ceiling on like a player like Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson?
At pass rush, I think it helps. I like to have a three-pronged rush, meaning I like to see two good edges and one good interior disruptor. And I think having that three-pronged attack on the pass rush, where you have producers at each spot in the line, really gives you an opportunity to keep the offensive line honest and not able to focus on opposing pass rushers. So I don't buy into the theory of too many mouths to feed when it comes to pass rushers. So I'm excited about the prospects of both Titans ends for sure, and the Jaguars. I mean, Travon Walker seems to be an ascending player. I hope he can continue to grow, and so I think that helps Josh Allen a little bit. And of course, the Jaguars picked up Eric Armstead too, who's not a hugely productive statistical player, but is still a pretty good player, and probably is a better pass rusher than anything that the Jaguars have currently on the roster has shown to date. I do think Devon Hamilton is really interesting deep sleeper, but I think Armstead really does help that unit come together.
I agree. I just, sometimes I think about things and I overanalyze, paralysis by analysis, and kind of, are they going to eat into each other's tackles? Is it going to cap one, or are they going to cannibalize each other? But no, I totally agree. Just that constant pressure, and it keeps them fresh. Those reps are going to be pretty nice. So moving to the second level there in the AFC South, who are your linebackers that you would select?
There's another one, right? You have arguably the top two fantasy linebackers, arguably, that should come off the board in fantasy drafts this year, in the persons of Foye Oluokun, who's finished first overall position in most formats for 3 years in a row, and then Zaire Franklin, who's been on a per game basis another top five type of a guy, so with very productive tackle numbers. And so Oluokun from the Jaguars and Franklin from the Colts. The only hesitation I have with either of those players is that Oluokun is going to play in a different defense this year. His defensive scheme has not been enormously conducive to tackle production, and he's been first anyway, in the sense that they've been, a little bit more single high in the last couple of years. And now they're going to a defense that's playing more man, and so there's certainly some downward pressure on his tackle numbers, but not anywhere. It's like, he's not a player that I would pick, because I don't pick linebackers early in fantasy drafts, but you got to have some hesitation about taking him first overall at the linebacker position. But I don't know how you take anybody else. I mean, who really is positioned to overtake him? So it's an interesting conundrum to have. But when this exercise, it's real easy to plug those two guys into your divisional all-star team.
So you're saying you're not going to have any shares of Oluokun anywhere across any of your teams?
Not in redraft. I have him in Dynasty, and I haven't had the heart to go out there and shop him, but not in redraft.
All right. So if you had to pick a third linebacker, who would be your third linebacker for the AFC South?
We'll take a guy that stays in division, although he's switched teams, and that's Azeez Al-Shire for the Texans. I think he comes in, wears the dot, and is pretty productive in the middle of the Texans defense. And that's a defense that's a little bit more too high and supports better tackle efficiency in the middle. So I'm excited about Al-Shire. I think he's probably a pretty good value. I think he's available as an LB2 in a lot of drafts, and I like that value pretty well.
Totally agree. Were there any other linebackers that you were even considering in there? I know these three are just like far and away ahead of them, but if there's another name you had to throw out, is it like a Devin Lloyd? Is it a Kenneth Murray type?
I guess if I had to, if you're putting me into a corner and making me choose somebody, I would choose Lloyd. But I worry about his ability to hold on to a full-time role, really only because of the coaching change. And what does that mean for the entire unit? I mean, Ryan Nielsen has been quoted as saying that all positions are up for review, that there is no depth chart right now. And so you got guys that, I mean, obviously Joshua Allen is going to continue to play. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But it makes you wonder, like, what does that mean? Does it mean there's an opportunity for rotation rotation? Does a guy like Chad Muma start to kind of show something? He hasn't shown a lot to date, but he was a guy that a lot of draft nicks really liked coming out. And so that's really my biggest concern. And then with the Titans too, I could see a scenario where the Titans don't have any full-time linebackers. So that makes me nervous. In Houston, you have another situation that's similar to Jacksonville, and you have Christian Harris is the presumed starter in nickel. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if Henry To'o got into his workload as he did last year. And then you got EJ Speed in Indianapolis, and he was obviously very productive when he had opportunities last year. But it's a guy I just cannot seem to buy into, and maybe that's probably the best answer now that they sit here and think about it is EJ Speed. But man, it's just hard for me to get excited about this guy. I mean, he's a smaller player, he's an older player. He's just now coming around to the point where he's the obvious starter in nickel settings, and so that's probably the right answer now to think about it. But I probably won't land him on any teams either.
Well, I apologize for backing you into a corner on that. You did very well. Good pivot. Good pivot. All right. So as we move into the third level of the defense, let's look at the cornerbacks. Who are your cornerbacks that you would like to have representing your AFC South?
And we got another one. We just have a couple of really good options, guys that have finished top 5 a couple of times in their careers and easy to plug into your lineup. And the first one is Kenny Moore, the Colts, and he's played well for a couple of different defensive coordinators. There are folks that may be a little sour on him because he was a bit of a letdown a couple of years ago, but that's because he played a lot of boundary due to injuries. He's expected to play back in the nickel this year. Got a nice contract extension, if I recall, it was like 3 for $30, and I think they've got their boundary corners identified this year, and I think he's primed for a solid year. And so I think he's probably a candidate to be the number 1 overall cornerback off the board unless you have some of these guys that are kind of safety types that have that designation. So I'm eager to see him do well. And the second one is L'Jarius Sneed, who's played for the Chiefs for the last couple of years. And Sneed's an interesting character in that he played slot a couple of years ago and was the number 1 overall corner. Switched to play mostly outside last year, but was still productive. And in large part because he's a bigger player, a lot of press man, and is playing closer to the line of scrimmage, is able to make some more tackles and get his hands on some footballs and pass by breaking up passes, by playing aggressively. And I think that he'll be used similarly in Tennessee. And so I don't worry too much about a drop off from the production levels we saw last year.
Yeah, just kind of follow up with Kenny Moore. Like when he plays over 1,000 snaps and 500 of them are on coverage and 500 of them are in press or in run defense, like that's huge for tackle numbers. So anytime we can get those box tackles, that's great, especially from your cornerback position. I had a question for you about Sneed. So you said that, or you mentioned that he moved from the nickels to the outside. Is that because Trent McDuffie pushed him out there, or I think Sneed emerged. I think that the Chiefs really were excited about what he offered as really a physical press man type of a cover guy. And so what you saw over the last year is, I think if I recall correctly, the Chiefs led the league in cover 2 and 2 high safeties, not necessarily cover 2, but 2 high safeties. And it afforded them the opportunity to bring both corners in and press. And so Sneed evolving, he came into the league as more of a slot guy, but I don't even remember who played at the boundary 3 or 4 years ago when he came into the league, but he emerged as a better cover player. And McDuffie came on, and he's a good player in his own right, but not as big as Sneed, and not quite the physical press man threat that Sneed turned out to be against X receivers and opposing teams. And so I think this is what appealed to the Titans in terms of trading for him. And Denard Wilson has spoken about how aggressive he's going to be on the boundaries, and he's a guy that's going to invest in interior pressure with Jeffrey Simmons and try to force the ball out of hands quickly and make quarterbacks make mistakes. And he's going to try to be disruptive at the line of scrimmage with his cornerbacks. They have also brought in Cheeto Awuzie to play a similar role on the other boundary. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of really physical play from the Titans. And I think that if Awuzie plays full time, he's an interesting prospect as a fantasy player too. But I think it remains to be seen whether he or Roger McCreary is the second full time player at corner in Tennessee. Yeah, it's with those types of players will definitely help the defensive line, get to those sacks a little bit longer. They can cover, they can hold those presses a little bit longer, and then it forces those quarterbacks to hold on. And you said like a player like Simmons, maybe we see, we haven't seen his ceiling yet, and maybe he was just waiting to get some better coverage downfield, and maybe get a couple more of those sacks and things like that. So, All right, one last position on the AFC South part. How about your safeties?
This was the first time I had any trouble. It's like I had to think about this one. What do I do with safeties? And so where I went is Julian Blackman for the. I always want to call him Justin Blackman, who was a really good receiver for a very short period of time for the Jaguars about 10 years ago. Julian Blackman, the safety for the Colts, is an interesting character in that he doesn't seem to be highly sought after as an NFL piece, but as the box safety in Gus Bradley's predominantly single high cover 3 defense. He's just piling up tackles, and he was productive until he got hurt. I was looking at Football Guys scoring, and he was the safety 4 in scoring after week 14 or 15, the week before he got hurt and was lost for the year and total points. And so I think that's kind of seems to be lost on some people about how useful of a fantasy asset he was. And so he's been signed back into it. I expect him to resume that role and be, pretty safe safety 1 for fantasy, just based on the access to tackles by playing close to the line of scrimmage. And so that's my first one. And then the second one is another one where it's like, wow, that's, it's getting more challenging here again too. And we had Darnell Savage as an interesting candidate to me, in that he's coming over from the Packers, and he's a guy that I think a lot of Packers fans really don't like. And so Jeff, you being in Wisconsin, I'm guessing you think this guy sucks. But the Jaguars are paying the guy 3 years, $22 million, so he's going to play. And there's some really interesting conversation in Jacksonville about what exactly is he going to play. If you look at the ESPN depth chart, he's showing up as a nickelback. And I do expect that he'll see quite a few snaps at nickel, but I also expect that he'll be the starting safety in base, and Antonio Johnson will come in as the third safety and play a box safety role. And so Savage will be the player that moves around, and he'll play complementing Andre Sisco. Sisco will be the deep player predominantly in Ryan Nielsen's defense. And Nielsen mixes up some 1 high and some 2 high, but I think that with Sisco's range, I think he'd be wise to keep Sisco deep and keep Savage close to the line of scrimmage. And also Nielsen plays a fair amount over fronts. He'll play some bare fronts. And in those cases, the slot defender might be more likely to attack than the box safety. And so I think that Savage is some sneaky upside as the safety, not a great pick or anything. We don't have anything near the caliber safety that we have at all the other positions in the AFC South. But I do think when you look at him compared to the other 8 teams the other 4 teams in the AFC South, that he's an interesting candidate. And what's really intriguing is that if he does get a cornerback designation on ESPN or some other fantasy format, he's a freaking huge asset. He's a possible overall cornerback 1 at the position for the year.
That's an interesting call, because I know that last year it was last man standing, because the Packers secondary was just decimated with injuries all year, and it was just this revolving door of who was going to be the player in, and they really had to be chess pieces, like you said. And so Savage does have experience moving around the lineup. He doesn't have to be just a predominantly, a box safety or a back deep safety. He can move around. So definitely he's had experience with that in the last couple of years. So were there any other players that were close to making it? It sounded like a lot of like slam dunks with a lot of these positions, but were there any other players that you were kind of trying to get in here somewhere?
Yeah, the other couple players we talked about having a flex. I mean, Will Anderson is my slam dunk flex. We have 3 really good edges here, and Will Anderson just isn't quite as accomplished as the 2 players ahead of him. But I mean, in other divisions, he'd probably be your starter. He'd certainly be a starter in the NFC South. So you got to like his upside. I mean, there's good opportunity there. And then the other guy that's out there in safety position is Jalen Petrie, who was the number 1 overall safety a couple of years ago. The scheme changed. He's playing more 2 high and just not as aggressive as a set. And so it's just the upside just isn't there like it used to be. So I'm not a guy who's really on Jalen Petrie, but he's had enough big plays in his career where you don't want to just kind of discount him entirely.
It sounds like the Houston Texans are well represented in this little exercise. Do you see them as like for leagues that play team defense? Are they a team that you are actively like looking at this year as a team defense? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I thought about that's a good question. I mean, yeah, this is a team they're going to get sacks. They have an offense which is ascending. This quarterback situation is okay. I don't love their quarterbacks from real life, but I think they're good enough in the quality of defense. We just saw an enormous change with the Lovie Smith leaving, and then DeMeco Ryans coming in to replace him. That defense was so much better after the change. It was pretty remarkable. And so you got to think that with a year of experience under their belt with a lot of those players, that they're an ascending unit and could only improve. It's really the whole team.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Top what defense? Top
10 easily. Would I put them in the top 5? I would think about it.
Okay, good enough. All right. Anything that stood out to you as far as anything in general about any of the positions or players? It sounded like it was pretty easy to select who was going to be in those positions. There weren't a lot of head scratching choices.
Yeah, I didn't really have any. There was really not a spot where I thought to myself, I just really torn. All those spots, I thought like the declension was pretty clear and to who fit in where. I mean, yes, you had Hunter and Allen really close at the top, but I got 2 spots right. But so, yeah, I was kind of struck by the star power of the AFC South. And when you and I originally communicated about this, I hadn't really thought about this division as being particularly strong. I mean, the team wise, they've had 500 teams getting into the playoffs the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. So I hadn't really thought about how good the defensive personnel, the star power at the defense was. So that was just kind of striking as how, and then from a fantasy standpoint, obviously Foye Oluokun might not be the best linebacker in real life in the NFL, but the fact that he's the number 1 fantasy linebacker for 3 years run, it's like, oh, well, it's just interesting to see the kind of the slight disparity there between fantasy and real life.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's flip gears here and let's head over to the NFC side here and let's take a look at the NFC South. And who are your defensive tackles you would like to have representing them?
We've got the first tackle is a breakout player from last year, and that's Derek Brown. That guy played a huge number of snaps. He's continually gotten better at run defense throughout his career, and really emerged as a premium run defender last year, and was getting close to 100 tackles. And so he's pretty easily my first tackle in a division that's a little bit light on talent. So happy to plug him in as my top one. My second guy is Grady Jarrett, and it's partly because I'm a Clemson homer. Partly because I think Grady Jarrett's a really good player and a really underrated player. I think that the only hesitation that folks would have is if they're thinking, all right, who would I take second at D tackle in the AFC and the NFC South based on fantasy production? You might say, well, Grady Jarrett's coming off an ACL. He'll be about 10 months removed from that ACL tear as the season starts. It's probably enough time for him to get in there. How effective he is a question. Does he have any compensatory injuries as he works his way back? Those are good questions. It's hard to answer those questions. But I look at Grady Jarrett, and the guy is just a good player. And he's one of the few interior disruptors with a track record of getting to the quarterback in the NFC South. And so he's my second guy.
And he's going to get a ton of run in Atlanta because they really don't have anyone. So if he's healthy, he's going to be out there for a ton of snaps. And speaking of a ton of snaps, Derek Brown blew away the NFC South in snaps. He was like close to 1,000 snaps, where the next closest guy was like 700. So he's, like you mentioned, he was getting close to 100 tackles. Well, he's playing 300 snaps more than the next closest guy. So, just out of curiosity, how close was Vita Vea to making your list here?
He was close. I mean, he's one of the 2 best, I think almost inarguably, one of the 2 best nose tackles in the NFL. And it's just, and you got to respect that he's put up a couple of seasons of 6 sacks, but it really is a ceiling in my opinion. And so he just doesn't have as many opportunities to collect stats because he's eating blocks so often. And so he's certainly, probably that third guy, I would say. And I thought about mentioning that. So I like Vea as a player. I think he's a great player. I'm just looking for a little bit more upside. And I think that the Jarrett probably offers that. But if folks are looking for the safer play at DT2 in the NFC South, it probably is Vita Vea.
So better real life player than fantasy production.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. All right. Moving on to the defensive ends. One of these is probably a layup, and then the second one, I'm curious where you're going to go with. So,
Carl Granderson is my first one. And it's like already getting deep. You're like, wait a minute, Carl Granderson? Oh, yeah. He was the guy that had double-digit sacks and 70 tackles or something last year that was predicted to be a sleeper by a good number of folks. And he totally delivered on that deal. He's an interesting player in that he came out of Wyoming, wasn't drafted because he needed to spend time in jail rather than go to training camp as a rookie. It's like, yeah, that's going to slow your player development a little bit. But
sounds
after
like a lot of players right now in Minnesota, especially. But
I don't. So Gratterson really emerged last year. As it kind of took over as the DE1 in New Orleans. He played more snaps than Cameron Jordan, even though Jordan was healthy. But Jordan's also 35 now. So, and he supplanted him as the top fantasy option at the position, and probably the best defensive end that they have now in New Orleans too. So that was a nice revelation. That was a guy I went out and traded for where I could last year. So I was happy to see that. And he returns as the top defensive end in the NFC South, in no small part because Brian Burns has left the NFC South. So that's as a Panthers fan, I was sorry to see that for sure. And so I don't know. I mean, heck, I mean, if we could. I don't know how deep we'd have to go before we start thinking about drafted Panthers edges in fantasy football. I mean, is it 60? I mean, it's just so rough. So my second guy this is where I'm digging for gold here, trying to find a nugget in the rough, and my choice is Yaya Diaby. Diaby is a guy that I liked coming in the NFL. Was he a rookie? Yeah, he was a rookie last year. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, but when he was coming in, he was a third-round pick out of Louisville, a guy that was raw coming in, had some athletic ability. I felt like had some upside. I took him in the 7th round of a 16-team league draft on a contract league and got him in there. So I was pretty happy about that. And I think he's a guy that flashed last year. Certainly that's because some of the pass blocking contention was afforded to Shaq Barrett and not Diaby, but Diaby was the third rusher with Joe Tryon on that team as well. And I'd like Diaby to come in and be the leader in terms of that pass rush unit. Tryon Shionka is probably just a guy at this point. I don't know how much more growth we'll see out of him. And so I'm more excited about the possible upside of Diaby coming into year 2 as a kind of a fantasy developmental player.
Yeah, when the Buccaneers didn't renew his rookie contract or took his 5th-year option, that's kind of the writing on the wall for Stranka there, that he's probably on his way out there. So, you were mentioning the Carolina Panthers defensive ends. I'm kind of thinking, like, is it DJ Woonham? Is it Jadeveon Clowney? Would it be Kayvon Chason or something? They got somebody.
Kayvon Chason is the third guy. Yeah. But Clowney's a good point. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're taking Clowney before age 60. That's probably, I didn't think about it. Wanham could play enough snaps just simply to be relevant too. So, but Clowney's such an enigma. Isn't he? He's on his 6th NFL team. He's posted 9 or 9.5 sacks 4 times. In other seasons, he's been a total missing piece. He played for the Titans one year, which I wonder if folks if you remember that. He barely got on the field. I don't even know if he got a sack that year. Just totally invisible. The other thing that's interesting about Clowney is he's never played on a truly bad team. All the teams he's played on have been at least 500 or thereabouts anyway. He's, and so he really benefited from a really successful defensive scheme last year that got a lot of production out of a lot of dudes, including Kyle Van Noy straight off the street. And so, I think some folks are thinking, oh, well, Clowney can continue his record of 9 sacks, I guess, in Carolina. And I'm not optimistic. He's not a guy that I'll be landing in any teams.
I'll take the under on that one. So, All right. Moving to linebackers. Now, the AFC had 3 easy slam dunks. Let's see if the NFC has 3 slam dunks as well. Who do you got at linebacker for the NFC?
We do have quality linebackers in the NFC. That's in the NFC South. That's one thing you got to say. In this case, that's interesting is that whereas in the AFC South, we had linebackers who were decent NFL linebackers, really good fantasy players. In this case, we have better real life players that aren't quite so effective in fantasy football terms, which is really interesting. But my duo is a couple of guys that are a little long in the tooth, like 35-year-old Demario Davis and Lavonte David might be 35 also. He's close. If he's not, he's 34. So 2 guys that are still in the league, still really good players. You got to like their ability to make big plays and create pressure when they have the opportunity to rush. And so that's appealing. If you're in a tackle heavy league, these guys aren't your cup of tea probably, but in a league where you're looking at big plays, these guys are still quality LB2s in my mind and more in those leagues that are like big 3 scoring, for example. So I like those guys a lot. I mean, I don't see any reason why they can't be productive again this year.
No, I'm right there with you. And maybe out of necessity, they had to be the two players here, because when you look across the rest of the division, if you were going to add a third into this group, who would be your third linebacker?
Yeah, the third is challenging because we have a lot of players who look like pretty good candidates, but not slam dunk 100% type players, right? And so I would just swing for upside in that case. My upside play would be Troy Anderson of the Atlanta Falcons to come in, and he lost most of his year last year, most of his season to injury. I like his opportunity to come in. I think has more upside than Caden Ellis. Caden Ellis is an interesting player. Was decent for fantasy last year, not ideal. I think he was probably pressed into service and coverage when they may not have wanted him to be that. Whereas I think that Anderson, he hasn't really shown as much as a younger player, has an opportunity to develop into a really good coverage player and really be that full-time player. So there's a lot of candidates that we could put out there. And I think that, that probably are going to see 80 to 90% of the snaps from the NFC South. And they're guys that you would want to flesh out into your LB3, LB4, LB5 spots in your fantasy teams.
Perfect. All right. We are moving on to the cornerback position in the NFC South. Who would you like to have on your roster?
Well, this is an interesting one in that I don't know if there's a player that I could name. I'll just go with a team, and that's the New Orleans Saints. It might be the smartest play to simply take two Saints and call it a day. The question is, can you accurately predict which two Saints will lead the group in snaps? They have four possible candidates, one being Marshawn Lattimore, who has been a good player for a lot of years. He is a prospective trade candidate, if you believe the rumor mill that it pops up on the internet, which, when you look at the fact that they got four outside corners, you see why somebody might say that. He'll be the sixth highest paid quarterback in the NFL, and he's been banged up last couple of years. And so the question is, does he come back and play effectively? Do they need him to? Can they trade him for something that's useful with the emergence of Paulson Adebo and the early investment of draft capital in Kool-Aid McKinstry? Adebo, I think, is an interesting player because last year there was some talk about him losing a full-time role. Lavonte Taylor was a second round draft pick who was expected to push him. Taylor was pushed into the slot, even though he didn't play very well because he didn't really have a better candidate. Taylor may push for an outside role. McKinstry's interesting that he was considered a first-round prospect by an awful lot of analysts, and he slid into the second round. And they were trying him out at OTAs to see if he could be a slot guy because, well, they just don't have a prototypical slot guy. I think there's a world in which McKinstry is the starting slot and plays on the boundary in base. And if that's the case, then he is a CB1 candidate league-wide, which is really interesting. Is the safe play is to go with Paulson Adebo because we saw last year. The upside plays are to come out with Marshawn Lattimore and Kool-Aid McKinstry because those two guys are the guys that look to have really premium upside as players, and Marshawn Lattimore having shown that in the past.
If you had to play NFL GM, where would you see Lattimore possibly getting traded to?
Oh my gosh. I was looking at the freaking Jaguars, man. Holy cow. These got nothing at the opposite boundary off Tyson Campbell. It's like, you got to think that another thing about the Jaguars is they brought in Ryan Nielsen, a defensive coordinator. And he's a guy that likes to play some press man and, play some Tampa 2 with some press up front in front of that, even though you're, it's actually zone, but you're carrying that guy several yards downfield. And I think Lattimore is a guy that could really fit and do that. Whereas, the guys that they have on the roster now, you're looking at Ronald Darby, who's had moments in his career, but has been in the league 10 years and struggled to stay healthy. After that, you're looking at young no-name type guys, third, fourth, fifth round picks. So that's a team that just desperately needs corner help.
And that makes a lot of sense. You don't want to play that player again. So you're putting him in the other division, the other conference. So you wouldn't see him, you're not trading him into a division rival or anything like that. So that makes a lot of sense. You're going to make a great NFL GM someday.
I'll do my best.
All right. Last position on the NFC side, your safeties.
Oh, finally, we got a slam dunk in the NFC South. This was like the only easy position. We had the top two scorers at the position in a lot of leagues last year, and Antoine Winfield and Jesse Bates. Winfield is just, he's just proven he can just do about everything. They've tried him in the slot. They've tried him deep. He's played a little bit of box action. Not a big guy, but really remarkable production as a tackler, despite the fact that he's not a big box safety type. And then you've got Jesse Bates, who I have to admit that I was a little skeptical on Jesse Bates as a top 5 option. I would shout out John Norton from Football Guys, who had him up there. I always thought that maybe Bates was more of a product of Cincinnati's really bad defenses, piled up tackles. But he came out and did everything he was asked last year. Still more of a deep guy than a shallow guy, but enough opportunities to attack and play near the line of scrimmage and Ron Nielsen's aggressive defense that he was able to make plays and piles up tackles. Those two guys had 2 of the top 5 safety seasons of the last 5 years based on Football Guys scoring. So it's easy to get excited about those two guys as your starting safeties in fantasy football.
So are you in the camp that if they score highly one year, you're not drafting them the next year, or is Winfield kind of like almost insulated from that?
Yeah, I think he's insulated from that. I was communicating with John Macri about that a little bit and talking with him about it. And I used to be totally of a mindset that I was going to base my safety selection almost totally on scheme. As long as the guy played full time and played in the box, it was just a slam dunk. And I didn't even really have to think much. And that worked like 2016, 2017, 2018. You look at all those top scores in those leagues, and it's just, as long as you had a box safety, you just take 3 or 4 of them in a draft at the end of your draft. As long as the 2 that stayed healthy were going to be studs for you the whole year. And it was just, like 2018, I think like the top 6 safeties by total points were all box safeties. And if Buda Baker and another guy would have been at the top 8 had they stayed healthy, right? And it's kind of changed now. We have players who are good players who manage to stay high in scoring, even if their role doesn't look like a plum role. You see that with the 2 guys we're talking about here. You see that with Minkah Fitzpatrick. And so there's enough talented guys. If I have an opportunity to get a talented guy at a discount, I'll worry a little bit less about his role than I would have in the past.
Any idea why? Just the change in offenses being more pass happy, less in the box. So they got to play a little more, all over, a little more chess piece, like we said before.
Well, I think that 2016, 2017, 2018, you saw an awful lot of defenses that looked like Gus Bradley's defense. And Gus Bradley's defense takes a player like Julian Blackman, and makes him, that's twice is right. Makes him a fantasy asset. And he's a guy that, was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he sat on the couch for a couple months or at least a couple weeks until the Colts decided to bring him back. So he may have been fielding offers, and the offers that didn't come into his liking, I suppose, but he's back. And that used to be an easy formula. And now you're seeing these defenses, which rather than having a guy playing 700 snaps deep like he used to, and then a box safety, you're seeing a couple different things. You're seeing either the single high teams being more interchangeable in the way they use their safeties. And that's how, like the Jaguars and the Falcons were last year. You saw a lot of interchangeability, and the Bucs to an extent too. And so as a result, you rarely see a deep safety play 700 snaps. You'll see every safety, both safeties often play a healthy number of snaps deep. So you have that aspect of it. And then you have the 2 high teams. And then in the case of the 2 high teams, you're looking at not only interchangeability, but often situations where both of them are back. And when both of them are back, the slot player has an opportunity to attack. And that's what the Bucs were trying to do a couple years ago when they moved Antoine Winfield into the slot, and then injuries required them to push him back into a more of a typical safety position. But the last thing you're seeing some defenses that are trying to build walls up front. And it used to be when we were kids, when we played football as a kid, it was always told and coached to force the runner back inside. And you don't see it in the NFL. You don't quite see that anymore. In the era of light boxes, they're not trying to force runners inside so much as they are string the play out to the sideline. Without the wide boundaries that you have in college football, with the hashes closer together and your speed at linebacker, you're able to chase those plays down and minimize and create big chunk gains on the edges of the defense or the run game. And so in that case, if the box safety he's just part of a unit that's chasing to the boundary. The slot defender is on one side or the other, and there's a 50% chance he's on the right side of the field to make a tackle in that run game. And so he is, I think the whole thing has leveled the playing field, whereby the margins are so thin at safety, almost not quite regardless of lineup, but the margins have become so thin because of the equalization and playing time by alignment that you see the really good players and their ability to create big plays being of more value than it was 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that with the repeating of those names on the list every year. So, 10 years ago, there was a really good chance that there were 3 or 4 names on that defensive back list, top 10 every year for a couple of years. And we haven't seen that in the last, 5-6 years. It's been, if you make the top 12 one season, there's a very little chance you're going to see that name on that list again the following season. And to your point, I just think there's so much more flexibility. There's not a true box safety anymore. You have to be a chess piece and moving all over. And just the way the offenses are evolving, you're just going to see so many more defensive backs on the field. And that's why we're seeing, this new generation, these new fresh names every year in and year out on the defensive back list. So listening to you just share that out, I felt like the Far Side cartoon with the kid whose brain is really small and he's asking to leave the room because his brain is full. So you just blew me away with all that. That's
you gotta say so.
That's some great stuff there. So
thanks, bud.
Yeah.
My goal is to know just enough about real football to be dangerous and therefore be competent in fantasy football.
Well, you can check that box. You can definitely check that box. So, Tripp, is there anything a takeaway from the NFC side? As you're kind of going through it, I know that you said it was pretty easy. It was very good players on the AFC side. It was easy slam dunk who to pick. What about the NFC side?
Well, it makes you worry, right? If you're finding so much difficulty of finding quality players in the NFC South. I mean, that was interesting that the two divisions were both mediocre last year, and the NFC South was weaker than the AFC South. And you can't be excited about the prospects of the NFC South this year. I mean, you're looking at another team being 8-8 or 8-9 and winning that division again. I think that in itself was disappointing. But I will say too that I'm an NFC guy in the sense that I've been to 6 NFL stadiums to watch games, all in the NFC. I've lived in 3 NFL TV markets, all NFC. Kind of an NFC guy. Cowboys and a Panthers fan. My dad was a Bears fan, and I was like, I wanted the NFC to win one because you were telling me that the other 2 divisions, the East and the North, that the AFC won. Well, the NFC's got to win one, and then so I started going through the players, and I started with the AFC South and just going through the tackles and ends. Like, oh gosh, this is just going to get ugly in a hurry. I was disappointed in that sense.
and it's funny because, talking to Aaron and talking to Johnny too, when we were going through the evaluation part of it, the AFC just seemed to have such dominant players at the position. Like you look at the AFC North with the defensive ends between Myles Garrett and TJ Watt, like they're elite, they're arguably top 5 at the position. And then you come here to the AFC South and look at linebackers, and you're looking literally at probably 3 of the top 10 linebackers across the whole NFL. Not even just the AFC and NFC South, but across the entire NFL are all in this division. So it's a really competitive group. So, all right, well, not to tip our hat, but let's go to our votes here and we'll kind of see where we kind of play out. So, now that we're going to outline the players, let's go ahead and take our divisional points and we'll see where we're at. So a defensive tackle, would you rather have DeForest Buckner and Jeffrey Simmons or Derek Brown and Garrett?
Well, it depends on a fan or a GM. And if I'm a GM, I want the AFC South guy with Buckner and Simmons. As a fan, I'm a Clemson homer and a Panthers fan, and I want those guys, but I know better.
Yeah, I'm there with you. I just think the production of Buckner, and like you said too, I love that idea of Simmons not reaching his ceiling yet. He's a player I'm kind of walking away with a lot of these best ball drafts that we're doing. He's just kind of like the later round value and a defensive interior that you're just getting for cheap, and he's just a player like you said, hopefully haven't seen his ceiling yet. So, all right, that's 2 for the defensive tackles for the AFC South. The defensive ends, we have Hunter and Hines Allen or Granderson and Diaby.
Yeah, it's another one. It's just a huge slam dunk. I mean, Granderson is way, way behind, even Will Anderson, who we mentioned too. We got Hunter and Allen too. So yeah, it's two more for the AFC South.
Okay. Linebackers, I know that where we're going to go with this. We got Oluokun, Alshire Franklin, or Lavonte David, Demario Davis, and Troy Anderson.
Yeah, another one where the three AFC South guys are probably, you could argue Alshire over the two old vets, but still, it's quite possible you would take the three AFC South guys and then the three NFC South guys.
And do you feel that Shire is going to have a better season than last year because he's going to have a better defensive line playing in front of him? Or is that going to take away tackle opportunities?
I don't think so too much. I mean, that's, you're talking about, it's a chance that chances tackle numbers go up a little bit playing in more of a too high unit. And so, I think that, I think I mentioned him as a LB2. I think as a, if you're getting him 15th or so, I like that.
Okay. Good to know. All right. Cornerback position, we can have Moore and Sneed or Terrell and Adebo.
Yeah, I got to go with the proven production of those two AFC South guys. It's just another one where it's just easy. You're talking, two of the top 7 or 8 cornerbacks off the fantasy board, they're both in that AFC South. So that's an easy choice again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, playing that nickel spot is a huge cheat code anytime you can get that. Mm-hmm. And so far, it's been a sweep. We've got all AFC. Let's see if the last position at safety position, we have Blackman Savage or Bates Winfield.
Yeah, got it. Finally, right? Finally one for the NFC. At the last line of defense, I guess that makes sense with the division that's so bad. It's allowing so many deep plays. I guess the safety's got to get some tackles. So we'll take Bates and Winfield, but not just for that reason, but also because they're two really good players. And we talked earlier about them. It's nice to have good players in safety.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's interesting that you say that because we didn't have any of the, very few Atlanta Falcons players on any of the front stuff. And then we have Bates at the end. We had very few, I guess a couple Tampa Bay Buccaneer players, but just on the back end, they're just like in real life, they're getting those tackles on the back end because no one's getting them in the front side. So
yeah,
at the flex spot. Yeah, definitely. We had the flex spot. We had Will Anderson versus Josie Jewell as our flex position for the AFC, NFC South. Who you got?
Yeah, it's going to depend a little bit on your scoring system. If you're in a tackle-heavy league, you're going to choose a linebacker, whoever it is. But I think by and large, you should take Will Anderson. I like the idea of having upside, especially at that flex spot. You get a week winner on there. I think that's pretty attractive. I know there's a debate in IDP fantasy football. Do you want the consistency of the tackle numbers, or do you want the week winning upside? And I lean to the latter, especially when you're talking about the depth of a team, of a roster, of a starting lineup with IDP. I'm not as worried about consistency. I want splash plays if I can get them. And Will Anderson, I think, will provide those this year.
Do you feel that Jewell is pretty safe for this year as far as, job security and things like that? Or
I do. Macri and I talked about that on his podcast. We talked bounce backs and Jewell was his first or second choice and the bounce back thing. I mean, I think that the situation here is that Jewell was the green dot wearing signal relayer for Evero in Denver 2 years ago. Evero and the Panthers have sought him out, brought him over to Carolina, and he's there with Shaq Thompson. I think there's a good chance that they both play full time. Shaq Thompson and Frankie Luvo both played full time in week 1 of last year, and then Thompson got hurt in week 2. And so I think that Jewell's are pretty safe. I mean, not entirely, but I think he's 95% safe as a full time player this year for Carolina on a defense that's going to be too high, that should have good tackle efficiency in the middle, that should be, if that is a bad defense, right? And you got Derek Brown in front of it eating up tackles, so it's an interesting wrinkle to the thing. But I still think that Jewell's pretty safe LB2, to be honest with you. He goes as more like an LB3 in drafts, and I think that's good value.
Good stuff. Well, it's pretty much a landslide. The AFC continues their dominance in the IDP Battle Royale series with a score of 10-2. The AFC South takes the crown for the third. Any final thoughts on this exercise or anything that was surprising takeaways from doing this trip?
It's like I said, it was the two surprises were two lackluster divisions in terms of team quality. And you think that there's just, first blush, oh, this is going to be interesting or close. And then to see the level of fantasy talent in the AFC South versus the level of real world talent in the NFC South. And I don't think that the gap is that wide in real life. Maybe pass rusher. But edge defender. I mean, it's ridiculous. But but other than that, I mean, it's like it's interesting to see just how much more talent there was in the AFC South. And it's an interesting exercise just to think about, like, how do you place guys, right? I mean, it's like anytime you can kind of start to group guys together, it helps your process with ranking and thinking about where you would take guys in drafts. So I think it's a useful exercise just to compare and contrast your chips, so to speak.
So we do this episode again next year. Are there any rookies that were drafted into either the AFC or the NFC South that you see maybe making an impact this season, or maybe even seeing their names kind of maybe on this list next year?
Yeah, I mean, generally of a mind that it's really rare to get good fantasy production from a rookie. And when you contemplate the fact that there were no rookies taken in the first 14 or 15 picks of the NFL draft, the odds that a rookie comes in and is really productive right away, I just think are small. I know there's some folks that like Junior Colson from the Chargers. I'd be a little surprised if he came in and wore the dot and played full time for the Chargers as he did last year for the University of Michigan, just because his coaches are there. It could happen. But by and large, I think that all these guys that we're talking about are all guys we want to look towards next year. I think all the edges are being drafted too early for redraft. And so, there were 4 guys in the first round, but they were all like 15 to 25. And so that's just all reaches. Everybody's taking those guys ahead of the more established players who probably outsnap them on the rotation on those same teams. So I think that, we got to look forward to think, what can we get out of this? And these two divisions are interesting, and they didn't take a lot of talent at defense. And I guess, we talked about the pass rushers. I think we kind of thought that the NFC South would take pass rushers, and they really didn't. Not till like the third round or so. In the AFC South, I mean, again, maybe there's more focused on offense, but the players that are intriguing are Trevin Wallace was the 3rd round pick for the Carolina Panthers, and DJ Kelly, who does a little bit of stuff for IDP show, he's noted that you often see a spike from a 3rd-year linebacker. You often see a breakout a year, 2 or 3 years into his career. So he's a guy to keep an eye on, because he's not going to play this year with Shaq Thompson and Josie Jewell out there, unless one get hurt, obviously. But I think, there's a good chance that Shaq Thompson moves on or possibly even retires, whether by choice or just being left off our roster next year. I think Wallace is in good position to start and play full time next year. So that's pretty attractive. So folks in dynasty drafts, they're watching Peyton Wilson and Edgerrin Cooper and what's the other guy? Junior Colson, come off the board easily, well ahead of Wallace. And I don't know that Wallace is any less likely to make an impact earlier in his career than those guys, which is, I think, kind of interesting. And the last linebacker that's kind of in that mix in fantasy drafts is Cedric Gray of the Titans. And he's a 4th round pick. And that's to me is interesting too, that people are that excited. I really think that they're looking at the depth chart that the Titans have and thinking, well, they don't really have anybody. They paid Murray something. I mean, he's going to play, and they like Jack Gibbons. And I think that people are discounting the fact that he's there because he's a undrafted free agent and more of a 2-down thumper type. But I see no reason why Denard Wilson wouldn't just kind of rotate through and, mix and match peaches for a while. And so, maybe Gray emerges next year. So that's a guy to watch. But I think the folks are a little too excited about a 4th round pick in that case. And we'll start to look at edge, and we have, Braylon Trice for the Falcons. And I think in that case, there's certainly some room, but I think Arnold Ebiketie, that's a guy that I'm more interested in more immediately. It's interesting how quickly people forget about those, fairly high draft picks that, like we're talking with these guys that probably aren't going to emerge this year. They have a good chance to emerge in year 2 or year 3, and people are just so impatient. They're ready to draft the next guy without really considering the fact that a guy like Arnold Ebiketie is in a good position to break out this year. Whether or not is another say I don't think the guy has huge upside, but I do think he's interesting, and people should keep an eye on him. And so that's a guy for this year. So you got some other deep guy, Kalen Bullock at safety for the Texans. I thought he was more of a single high type of a guy. It's interesting to see him go to the two high Texans, who probably do have a void there. Jimmy Ward probably isn't there next year, and so Kalen Bullock may start there. But that's a really deep option. So not a ton to be too terribly excited about, I guess. But I mean, from a dynasty standpoint, there's probably some value to be mined in there somewhere.
Yeah, like you were saying too, with the rookie fever, and it's like the "what have you done for me lately" mentality. You just quickly move on, and there's some good value to be scooped up and talent that's kind of being overlooked. So great.
Yeah, I didn't touch on Latu. I guess I should have mentioned him. Right, that's kind of the obvious one, and the fact that he was the first defender taken. Yeah, first defender taken.
15th,
and that was the point
overall.
Yeah, and that was the point that I was making. This guy is going ahead of Samson Ebukam in redraft. Samson Ebukam was a productive player last year, really the best year of his career, journeyman type player, which is really interesting. But he was top 20 in pass rush win rate, according to NFL Next Gen Stats, as reported by ESPN. And the idea that that Latu is going to come in there and play immediately more snaps than Ebukam or Kwity Paye, I think is a gamble by fantasy gamers. And so that's a guy where I'm clearly looking at next year on, and I'm not going to have him in any rosters because everybody's looking for him this year. So sorry to cut you off, but that's kind of an obvious oversight there for a second.
No, and I kind of had the same take. Like we did a rookie, who would you keep trade hold kind of episode, and we did the three rookies between Verse, Turner, and Latu. And Latu was the guy that I was looking to trade off just because of draft capital and things like that. And I just see him having a harder path to snaps, like what you said with Kwity Paye there and with Ebukam there. I just think he's going to have much harder time getting snaps over Dallas Turner or Verse. I think Verse gets a little bit of run in LA more so. And I think Turner, with a very unestablished defense in Minnesota, I think he's going to probably find an easier path to snaps. Now, if he does or not with Van Ginkel there, we'll see. But I totally agree with you with Latu just kind of being not walking in and getting day one snaps. So totally agree. All right. So Tripp, before we wrap things up, what are you working on right now, and where can the great listeners find some more of your work?
Well, I'm over at Footballguys, footballguys.com, and on the app formerly known as Twitter at Dynasty Tripp. And we've been pumping out weekly articles, roughly weekly, called Reading the New Defense. And in Reading the New Defense, I look at changes in defensive coordinator and how their tendencies will affect fantasy output. So the last two that I put out here were the Commanders with Dan Quinn coming in, and the Chargers with Jim Harbaugh and Jesse Minter coming in, and thinking about how are they likely to use players, and will their tendencies towards one high or two high or man or zone, and how will those impact the players that either we've gotten used to using, guys like Derwin James, or guys that are in a new environment entirely, like Frankie Louvu or Bobby Wagner, and what are their prospects based on how they're likely to be deployed, and how does that differ from the past? So I think Bobby Wagner's another one where I'm fading a little bit, and it's really hard to fade Bobby Wagner because he's been so productive for so many years. But it's another defense where it's just hard to imagine how he keeps up that same level of production in a more one high attacking type defense, and that's a mouse to feed situation if I ever saw one. You've got like 3 linebackers and 4 safeties, all wrestling for snaps in there. It's like, holy cow! I mean, there could be 2 or 3 absolute studs in that group, but there could be a situation where nobody's playing 100%, and it's just a weekly nightmare.
It's almost kind of like your Saints cornerbacks situation. Mm-hmm. You got a shotgun approach to it rather than a pinpoint rifle approach. You got a kind of a spread attack on it. So.
And you take the old New England running backs approach where you just take the cheapest guy.
Yep. So, well, for all of our listeners and viewers out there, what do you think? Did we get the players chosen? It was the synopsis right, and did the points fall the right way? We'd love to hear from you down on the bottom in the comments section. So be sure to hit us up there. That'll do it for this episode of the IDP After Show. Join me next time as I'm joined by Mr. Jace Abbey from across the pond as we dive back into our IDP investor suits as we do a little buy, sell, and hold episode, this time featuring the defensive backs. To be sure that you don't miss that or any of the other IDP goodness, be sure you like, follow, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you never miss an episode of the IDP show or the IDP after show. For Tripp and myself, we say thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch up with you next time.
This was the IDP After Show.